Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The United Nations says the number of people on our planet has now passed 8 billion, and it's on an upward curve, with consequences that aren't clear-cut and which might not continue for very long. Parts of the global south, as it's known, are seeing the biggest population growth, in part driven by a lack of access to contraception. But wealthy societies across the world are facing the opposite issue. Their populations, in many cases, are actually getting older and more expensive, and the total numbers are going down. So what challenges are governments around the world facing from an ever-changing population? Very good to have you along. I'm David Foster. There are now more than 8 billion of us on Earth, and 80% of that population growth has been happening in what's called the global south, the poorer parts of the world. In European countries, though, and other advanced economies like Japan, the numbers are actually falling. Uneven population growth across the world comes with different challenges. Wealthy nations need to pay for the aging members of their societies that live longer than ever, while other regions, vulnerable to food scarcity and climate catastrophe, fear that more young people mean even fewer resources. So what are the solutions to a dilemma of providing for 8 billion, and will the number of people keep on growing forever? We go first of all to Memphis, Tennessee, and say hello to Jennifer Sciubba, author of 8 Billion and Counting. To Washington, D.C., Kathleen Mogelgaard waits us there, president of the Population Institute in Shelburne, Vermont. Also in the USA, Bill Ryerson, founder and president of the Population Media Center. Good to have all three of you on, just 3 out of 8 billion. The book was 8 billion and counting. Jennifer, how many more can the Earth take?
I think it depends on where you are around the world. So for me, I don't really feel that old, but I've already lived to see 5 billion, 6 billion, 7, and now 8 billion. And my life doesn't feel any different. If anything, it feels better than it was. But there are places in the world where people really do feel adding another billion or even 1,000 people if they're closely tied to their environment for their daily living, maybe for fuel wood for cooking, or maybe they get their food immediately from their environment. So I think where you stand depends upon where you sit around the world.
Those countries where more and more people are expected to be born by 2100, just pick 3 of them: Nigeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, and the countries expected to lose the most population by 2100, China, Japan, and Brazil. Let me ask you, Kathleen, if I may, what causes a country to lose population?
Countries start to lose population over time when their birth rates drop below their death rates. And that could happen for a number of reasons. It's happened in most countries because the fertility rate, the average number of children per woman, has declined over time. So we've seen that in a number of countries that are experiencing population aging, countries whose population growth rates have really slowed down, and whose populations in some places are starting to experience decline.
Is that because there is more birth control in countries such as China, where they had the one-child policy, Japan and Brazil, but not in those African countries that I mentioned?
Exactly. So there has been declining fertility in places where there's been excellent access to reproductive health care and family planning services, where women have greater equity, greater opportunities to receive an education, greater opportunities to enter the workforce, and have reproductive autonomy in their lives. All over the world, when women have access to those kinds of opportunities, services, and rights, what we see over time is declining fertility rates. So in the places where we continue to see very rapid population growth, for example, in the Sahel region of Africa, some countries there, the average fertility rate could be 5, 6, 7 children per woman. And that coincides with a lack of gender equity, a lack of opportunities for women and girls, and a lack of services that would enable people to determine the number, timing, and spacing.
Which is leading me to this particular point. one made by Elon Musk, who said that, quote, population collapse due to low fertility rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. Bill, you on that one. We have Jennifer saying that 8 billion and plus is okay depending on where you are and who you are. We have Kathleen talking about the fact that populations are shrinking where there is good birth control, but not where there isn't. So what about this? Population collapse is more dangerous to this planet, and he says, than global warming. There could be other things as well. But is it a real danger, population collapse?
The fact is that the planet is not infinite in its ability to support a growing population. We currently rely on non-renewable resources, and by definition, non-renewables are used up and depleted over time. So eventually we will be forced to live on 100% renewable resources.
I get that, but he's saying it's not an increasing population that's the danger. He said it is a decreasing population that is a danger. And I would imagine that is because you then end up with an aging population that the younger generations have to support. You are not seeing wage earners go up in terms of numbers because there is birth control, and therefore it becomes weighted on the scales the wrong way.
The problem with that analysis is he thinks that growth can go on forever and or stay at a level that it currently is. The best analysis we have of what's possible at a Western European lifestyle with renewable resources is about 2 billion. So we really need to move to declining populations, and the economics of that are in many ways much less important than the resource issues that we face.
So you disagree entirely with what Elon Musk is saying there. Let me come back to you, Jennifer. Japan, declining population. What were the worries? Because I think they've changed slightly, but what were the worries about Japan a few years ago? It was a fast developing economy, then the population started to slip. Is it what I've just outlined now, that society cannot support an older and bigger and aging population if you're not having more children?
I think we can reframe Elon to say it's the systems that are broken, not the population itself. So there's really no single population trend that is inherently good or bad. And this is where Bill and I would differ on this. I think it's really what you do with it. So in most places that have aging populations, these systems were set up for infinite growth. They were set up such that younger people supported older people financially, personally, taking care of them in old age. And so we need new systems to deal with a new reality. And it really is imperative because the whole planet is moving in that direction. I mean, there are places that are much further behind, but we're generally converging towards aging populations that will be shrinking. So we need to start really taking that seriously and redesigning our system.
And redesign it in what way would you suggest?
Well, we have to think more about work. For example, I had a piece out in Harvard Business Review just a couple of days ago that looked at how aging populations, we have to rethink what is old. And that is a social construction itself, thank goodness. So if we think about how old we are and what's our place in the workforce, do we have rules that force people to retire, mandatory retirement, for example? We need to think about redesigning our systems so that if people want to stay in the workforce longer, they're not forced to retire. We have to think about flexible work, allowing people to be part-time, for example. And then we also have to think about how aging looks different in different societies. So in some places, the family is the responsibility for taking care of old people. And in some places, the government is. And aging will look different in those kinds of contexts.
Well, Kathleen, over your right-hand shoulder, we've got a frame in which is a piece of paper that says beyond 8 billion. Your thoughts on what happens once we get 8 billion. But I'm also going to bring up a graphic on the screen. This is from the UN, and it goes back to what Jennifer was saying. You know, it started in 1950 or thereabouts with slightly more than 2 billion, steady increase all the way up to about 2050, 2060, which obviously we haven't got to yet, and then it levels out. So says the United Nations, or predicts the United Nations. Your thoughts on beyond 8 billion? Are we going to see something almost like a Malthusian factor where the population numbers take care of themselves? If there isn't enough food, then people die off. If there is enough food, then population thrives, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts?
It's a really important question. We are talking about beyond 8 billion because we really believe that passing this population milestone is an important reminder to us that we need to understand demographic trends better in the way we organize ourselves collectively as a society. I think there remains a lot of a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of how demographic trends affect our lives. And just what Jennifer was just talking about in terms of population aging. Are we doing what we should be doing to plan for continued population aging across the world? It has lots of implications for how we organize ourselves as society. And similarly, as we sail past this 8 billion milestone, we are likely to maybe add another 2.5 billion to the world's population before we stabilize. What else does that mean, especially in the places that are continuing to grow rapidly? What does that tell us about women's rights in those places, about the status of women, about the ability for girls to get an education, and about the ability for people to access reproductive health care and family planning services? I keep coming back to this point, but the United Nations Population Fund, in their State of World Population report this year, told us that there is a neglected crisis of unintended pregnancy around the world.
Well, no, please do carry on. I was going to come to it. I was going to come to it towards the end of the program about pregnancies. And when you say reproductive health care, I suppose you mean contraception. Why don't we play this in from the Deputy Director for Management at the United Nations Population Fund, Ib Peterson. You may well know Ib Peterson. Let's hear.
Almost half of all births every year globally, meaning around 120 million, are unwanted pregnancies. And they are a sign of for many cases that women don't have the access, or young girls, to decide themselves when to have babies.
So what do? Tell women that there is contraception out there when in many parts of the world they can't access it? What do you do?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that we're making a distinction between unwanted and unintended. So right now, about 50% of pregnancies worldwide are unintended. For some people, that's a very happy accident. For others, they're not ready and they would like to wait a little bit longer before they have their next child. So I think a really important thing that we need to be doing is offering not just family planning, but comprehensive reproductive health care for people everywhere. No matter where you live, you ought to have access to information and services about your reproductive life so that you can have autonomy in your life and be able to determine for yourself when and whether and with whom to become a parent. So that involves family planning, but it involves a whole set of reproductive health care that is really culturally appropriate, that dispels myths and misinformation about pregnancy, about childbirth, and about different contraceptive options. We are not doing nearly enough to serve people's needs in this way.
Okay, can I just pose this one? It's all very well offering advice, but sometimes you have to impose rules to make sure that things don't fall apart. What are we talking about here? Telling somebody that this is the right thing to do, but it's your choice, and then things go wrong? Or are we going to have to lay down rules as a globe about what is right and what is wrong in terms of what our planet can manage with, I suppose, in terms of people and what it can produce? Kathleen, and then I'll come to you, Bill.
I think you might be asking if we need to have a population control policy, if we need to have, for example, a 2-child policy or a 1-child policy, and I would say absolutely not. The lessons of the past have shown us that that is not only an egregious violation of human rights, but it also doesn't really work over the long term. What we've seen from examples in China, for example, is that there's a heavy-handed top-down government policy that has actually engineered their demographics in a way that they're really struggling with now. So what we believe at the Population Institute is that the best way to go about this is to ensure that people have access to information, that they have access to opportunities, and that they have access to services in order to really make decisions that are best for themselves in that moment.
Okay, Bill, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to Bill. I'm going to go to Bill because we only have a limited amount of time. All very well if people are offered advice, but as many a parent will tell you, not so good if they don't take it.
It really is not a matter of giving people advice. When you look at the non-users of contraception worldwide, there are about 1 billion adults who do not use any modern method of contraception. Half of those, roughly, don't want a pregnancy and are not using contraceptives for 3 important reasons. One, they've heard it's dangerous, misinformation about safety and effectiveness. Second, religious opposition, and third, spousal opposition. And those key barriers are what is important to help people overcome through providing really role modeling to make it understandable to people what the effects are of using methods or not using methods in terms of health and welfare. So what Population Media Center is doing is using long-running serialized dramas in which key characters address these issues in their family life through making decisions, and the audience sees consequences of those decisions. And then audience members decide for themselves. That's a much better approach than telling people what to do.
I noticed that you said in your conversation with one of our producers that if big money is put into family planning and education of girls, it would achieve 25% of what is needed to mitigate climate change. Explain that, would you?
That's correct. The UN Environment Program issued a report 3 years ago that found that expanding human habitation and human farming are the primary causes of loss of wilderness areas like the Amazon rainforest that serve as the lungs of the world. And so as human farming in particular expands into wilderness areas and depletes biodiversity, we are also affecting the climate in a serious way, because the ability of those forests to absorb carbon and to produce oxygen is reduced. So this is a very important issue as we face a worsening climate to address.
Bill, what I don't get here, what I don't get is you say you put money into family planning and girls' education. Really what you're saying with the Amazonian issue is the fact that greedy companies are deforesting important areas. They're knocking them down. You don't see people building cities in the Amazonian rainforest. You see them all moving into central urban areas anyway. So how does family planning and girls' education save the rainforest?
Interestingly, a project called Drawdown looked at what is necessary to achieve climate stability, and they recognized that expanding human populations are a factor. It's not just greedy corporations, but of course that's also the case. And they recognized that girls' education combined with information and access to family planning are key to solving the climate crisis.
Jennifer, let me come to you. Countries expected to gain, I've had this up on the screen earlier in the program, no harm in putting it up again, the most population by 2100, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania. This is people moving from poorer countryside, rural areas, isn't it, into centres of population. Am I right with that? Most of the time you're finding that the cities are getting bigger rather than the countryside areas?
Yeah, in general, that is a general trend. And of course, many areas of the world are already saturated in terms of their urbanization, which I think is a point you were making about South America. But yes, so as we see the populations expand in places where fertility is high, we're also seeing a movement from rural to urban areas.
Are you saying really that we don't need to worry too much about this, that the planet will take care of itself?
I wouldn't say that exactly, but I also am not at all an alarmist about it. So I think if you are living in a country like Nigeria, where the size of the territory is going to stay the same, but the number of people will double, you have to think very strategically about how you use your resources and what kind of systems you put in place. And actually, if we have our crystal ball, which thanks to demographics, we do, that's what I love about it, we know that Nigeria will eventually head towards an aging and then shrinking population. So I actually look at this as an opportunity to put in place systems that could be sustainable for the people there in the long run as well. And I think it's also important for us to maybe check ourselves in the high income countries and our importance on the planet.
Okay, so
Because
the
so much
money
of
the
this
money
is
should come from us, the richer countries, and richer countries are being told all the time that they have to pay to help everybody else way around the world, particularly when it comes to climate change, as we heard at COP27. But I'm wondering this: isn't it up to the government in Lagos to actually do something about this, rather than for the rest of the world to do something about it? And yet in Africa you have rampant corruption. They're unlikely to do something that isn't going to be of a benefit to their population for another 50, 60 years. They want results tomorrow for themselves.
But we have seen this happen across the globe. So we should take heart to know that there were 125 countries with a total fertility rate of 5 or more at the time Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, and now there are 8. And it's not as if we have fewer corrupt governments today on the whole. So we know that it's possible to message this in a way that makes leaders understand that their economies will develop. I mean, what's nice about family planning and girls' education is it yields social dividends at the same time that it actually helps individuals and families. And so getting that message across and getting the buy-in of leaders, Kathleen's organization would be one of those that works on that. Population Reference Bureau in DC is another one. Those really can help leaders understand how it's in their best interest to make these investments.
Kathleen, if there's one thing that should be done tomorrow to make sure that beyond 8 billion, I'll reference it once again over your shoulder, is not a problem, it's a boon to the planet, what would it be?
One thing, it is very difficult to choose just one thing, but I think investing in women and girls, as Jennifer was saying, helps to yield dividends for those people today across societies, across families, across nations, but also sets us on a path for greater sustainability in the future.
I was looking at this, and in fact I brought it up on the screen, the People of the World from the United Nations, a timeline which talks about around about 2050 or 22, let me put my glass on, 2100 is actually going to level off. The question I asked at the beginning was, how much can the Earth cope with? When would it go bang, Kathleen, and then you, Bill? What number?
What number will our population end up at in the future?
No,
Is that your
what
question?
number is totally unsustainable?
Well, I'm a believer in that it depends, because our impact on this planet is a product of a number of different variables: how many we are, how much we consume, and what kind of technologies are in place. Those are the factors that affect the impact that we have on the planet. So it's really up to us and the choices that we make, the priorities that we make, how we decide we want to live.
Okay, I get that, Bill. But let me come to you. Same question, phrased slightly differently, because what Kathleen has been saying is it all depends what you do when it becomes unsustainable. If we carry on doing what we are doing right now, when does that balloon go bang?
It's hard to know, because changing technology makes the number that's sustainable under the current economic system hard to measure. But clearly, climate change is a symptom of the fact that we're living beyond the capacity of the planet to absorb our waste products now. So moving towards girls' education, stopping child marriage, and making family planning services and information available is critical to avoiding that crisis point you talked about.
But isn't that doing just what many people have criticized the Western world for doing, which is forcing our values, if you like, on people who look at things differently?
We absolutely are not forcing our values on anyone if we're making education available and making family planning services and information available. The governments of the world are attempting to do this, and UN agreements have had almost universal acceptance that making it possible for people to have the number and spacing of the children they want is a human right.
Well, it all depends who you talk to, I suppose. More Catholics in the world than any other religion. Their supreme leader says contraception's a terrible thing, so we will all be arguing about this until the cows come home, or indeed until the cows sink in the swamp, or whatever's going to happen to this wonderful planet of ours. Listen, thank you. Very good to have the three of you on, 3 out of 8 billion plus, but 3 very important people. Jennifer, Kathleen, Bill, thank you very much indeed, and wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Round Table. Don't just think of yourself as one or two people, but part of the population of this planet that needs to survive. Thank you for watching. Hope to have your company next time. Till then, bye-bye.